dragged from his seat, laughed at, stripped of dignity 30,000 feet above ground, not for breaking rules, not for causing trouble, but for daring to sit where they didn't think he belonged. They called it a protocol. They said it was routine. But the looks told a different story. The smirks, the whispers, the stewardess who spilled juice on his coat, then muttered that cheap fabric wouldn't stain. The man across the aisle who asked if he was part of a prison rehab program. The flight crew didn't stop it, they let it. And no one asked why he was there. No one cared. All they saw was skin, not status. All they saw was a black man in a seat they believed should have stayed empty. But what if that man had the power to bring down every one of them with a single decision? What if this wasn't just a flight, but the beginning of a reckoning? You're not ready for what comes next. If you're drawn to stories that cut deep and reveal what hides behind polished smiles, subscribe now. Comment below where you're watching from, and tell us this. Would you have stayed quiet or stood up? Calder Boone stepped into the aircraft's first-class cabin with the quiet assurance of a man who had walked through judgment his entire life. The hum of air vents and the subtle clink of glassware filled the space, but the real noise was unspoken. His coat, an old wool blend with faded elbows, hung loosely off his broad shoulders, its stitching frayed in places but intact. His hair, tight curls close to the scalp, bore the mark of meticulous care, yet it drew glances sharper than razors. His shoes, though buffed to a military shine, lacked the sheen of luxury brands. As he made his way towards seat 2C, the carpet under his feet dulled the sound of his steps, but not the weight of his presence. The first attendant he passed, a blonde in her early 30s with a clipped posture and a smile practiced for donors, tilted her head toward her companion and whispered something just loud enough to suggest intent, but too low to risk consequence. The second attendant, with an auburn bun and a face that looked carved from marble, gave a tight nod and murmured back, glancing briefly at Calder's coat before returning to her tablet. The third, a woman with tired eyes and impeccable eyeliner, followed Calder with her gaze and reached for a sanitizing wipe as soon as he touched the headrest. She leaned over the armrest and ran the cloth in a single slow arc, as if erasing a mistake. Calder noticed, of course, but his face didn't flinch. He hoisted his canvas duffel, worn at the seams, sun-faded on the sides, into the overhead bin, sliding it in with the gentleness of someone who owns very little but values everything. As he lowered himself into his seat, the leather beneath him creaked slightly, echoing louder in his ears than it should have. He straightened his back, pulled a paperback from his inner coat pocket, and opened it, eyes scanning the page but absorbing nothing. Across the aisle, a man in a graphite gray blazer leaned toward his wife, a woman with a pearl bracelet and judgment drawn into her cheekbones. The man whispered into her ear, and she responded with a tight smile and a pointed glance at Calder's seat. Neither of them tried to hide the exchange. A row ahead, a teenager with tousled blonde hair turned around and studied Calder for a full 5 seconds before his mother tapped his arm and gestured for him to face forward. Calder turned the page in his book, slowly, deliberately, and tried to read. The words, though familiar, blurred behind the pressure building in his temples. His skin itched with the unspoken accusation that clung to him like sweat. When the beverage cart rolled down the aisle, the same blonde attendant stopped at every row with champagne and practiced charm. To a man in 1A, she offered a generous pour and a joke about how the wine matched his tie. To a woman in 2A, she smiled and asked whether she preferred sparkling or still. When she reached Calder, she paused for half a second, adjusted the tray slightly, and then moved on without a word. Calder said nothing. He watched her go, then folded the page of his book and placed it gently in his lap. Moments later, the man assigned to 2D arrived. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven, with a jaw sculpted by golf clubs and Botox. He wore a navy suit with fine pinstripes and cologne that stung the air. He looked at Calder, then at his ticket, then back at Calder. His brow creased, not in confusion, but in distaste. He hesitated before sitting down, then finally eased into the seat with a grunt, muttering something under his breath that Calder couldn't quite hear. The man didn't introduce himself. He simply turned his shoulder toward Calder, angled his body away, and pulled out a sleek black tablet. tapping the screen with exaggerated urgency. Calder turned his eyes back to the front. Across the aisle, the couple from earlier exchanged another glance, this time joined by a slight chuckle from the woman. She tilted her head toward Calder's shoes and shook her head. One row back, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a silk neck pillow leaned forward, looked at Calder, and leaned back again without speaking. His silence screamed volumes. As the final boarding announcements came over the intercom, Calder reached into his coat once more, this time pulling out a folded slip of paper. He opened it slowly, read the single line written in tight cursive, and folded it again. The words stayed with him as the captain's voice echoed overhead, welcoming everyone aboard and promising a smooth ride to San Francisco. Outside, the sky had begun to shift into gold, the sun edging toward horizon behind a wall of clouds. Inside, Calder sat still, hands resting on the closed book, breath even but shallow. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the murmur of conversation rose and fell like a distant tide. Calder looked out the window and saw his own reflection in the glass. It stared back at him, framed by the glow of overhead LEDs and the cold gleam of crystal cutlery. He blinked once. Then he turned away. The aircraft tilted upward, lifting off with a quiet roar. The pressure shifted in the cabin, pressing lightly against his chest, but the weight he carried remained untouched. Not gravity, not physics, something else, something older, more cruel, more constant. The man beside him sighed loudly, adjusted his armrest, and deliberately let his elbow fall against Calder's. He didn't apologize. Calder shifted back, careful not to give more than an inch. The man smirked and returned to his tablet. 10 minutes passed before a different attendant appeared. Male, younger, eyes less clouded by superiority. He offered water to the row, handing glasses to each passenger. When he reached Calder, he paused, checked his tray, and frowned. No more glasses. He offered a napkin instead and promised to return. Calder accepted the napkin with a nod. The glass never came. A few rows up, someone called for assistance. The attendant left. Calder was forgotten. The woman behind him tapped her call button to request an extra pillow. When the attendant returned, she pointed to Calder's row and said she didn't feel comfortable. Something about the smell. He overheard her. So did the man beside her. So did the boy across the aisle. No one objected. The attendant nodded, said he'd note it. Calder folded his napkin and tucked it under his tray table. He hadn't touched the touchscreen. He hadn't spoken since boarding. He simply sat, stoic, reserved, and quietly out of place in a space that had already decided he did not belong. The man beside him had leaned his seat back within seconds of reaching cruising altitude and now sipped a glass of bourbon with a smirk that never quite left his lips. The rest of the passengers had resumed their quiet consumption of luxury. But Calder knew better than to assume the worst was behind him. His instincts were rarely wrong. They didn't fail him now. The blonde flight attendant from earlier returned, her demeanor no longer merely distant. It had sharpened into something cold and clinical. She held a portable scanner in one hand and her tablet in the other, approaching Calder's row with a polite, mechanical smile that didn't reach her eyes. She stopped directly beside his seat and addressed him with the same rehearsed tone she had used for the safety announcements. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" Calder turned his head slowly, measuring her expression. He didn't ask why. He didn't challenge the request. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the same printed stub he had already shown twice. The attendant took it and scanned the barcode. The machine beeped. She frowned, glanced at the tablet, then scanned it again. Another beep. Still nothing. Her lips tightened. Calder kept his gaze steady, unmoving. She tapped the screen, adjusted the scanner, and tried a third time. Beep. The same result. She stepped back slightly and turned to the attendant across the aisle, motioning discreetly but deliberately. The brunette from earlier, who had wiped his seat, approached with her own tablet in hand. They whispered. It wasn't a hushed whisper. It was the kind designed to be heard but not clearly understood. Calder caught a few phrases: manifest update, error code, non-tier passenger. The second attendant nodded, then looked directly at Calder and asked for identification. He handed over his ID with the same steady patience, knowing full well that no one else had been asked to provide theirs. She glanced at the ID, at the name, and back at him. Then she walked away. The blonde didn't leave. She stood over him, scanning and rescanning the pass like it was counterfeit. Calder turned his eyes forward, pretending not to notice that passengers in nearby rows had now shifted in their seats, some turning heads, others leaning subtly to listen. Within minutes, a new figure appeared in the cabin, tall, lanky, and wearing a badge clipped to a blue blazer. Ground operations, Calder assumed. The man approached quickly, hunching slightly as he moved through the low ceiling of first class. The blonde explained the situation with a frown that exaggerated concern, stating that the system had flagged a discrepancy. She handed him Calder's pass and ID. The man took them both, studied them, then pulled a small scanner from his belt and ran the barcode again. A pause, a double check, another pause, then a low sigh. He nodded once, handed everything back to the attendant, and said something short that Calder couldn't hear, but understood in meaning. He had passed the test. Again, the blonde turned to Calder with the smallest flicker of disappointment behind her smile. "Thank you for your patience, sir," she said, a line that tasted scripted. "We've just been updating our internal records. Everything's fine now." Calder didn't respond. He folded the boarding pass neatly and slid it back into his pocket. The ground agent turned and left the cabin. The two attendants walked away, saying nothing further. But the performance was over, and the audience had seen the whole show. A man 2 rows ahead was now openly staring at him. A woman across the aisle had stopped flipping through her magazine. The air had thickened again, not with tension, but with suspicion. Not one of them had seen any of the other passengers asked to re-verify their tickets. Not one of them had been rescanned, triple-checked, or matched against ID. Only Calder. The man beside him chuckled quietly, shaking his head as if confirming something to himself. He sipped his bourbon, then placed the glass down and finally spoke. "Guess they really want to make sure, huh?" Calder didn't answer. His hands remained in his lap. His breathing remained even, but his jaw had tensed. The attendant returned again, this time with a tray of drinks. She bypassed Calder's row once more, only to pause, look over her shoulder, and then lean toward the woman in 1A. Her voice, meant to be discreet, carried far too easily. "We've had a few seat upgrades from the support program. Just trying to confirm who's where. It gets tricky." The woman nodded understandingly and glanced back at Calder. Her expression shifted to something between pity and irritation. Calder sat motionless. The support program. He knew what that was. Vouchers for veterans, giveaways from charity organizations, community raffles meant to symbolize inclusivity while drawing lines beneath the surface. He hadn't used one. He didn't need to. But now, to the rest of the cabin, he had been quietly labeled as a participant in that system, a guest who hadn't earned his seat but had been given it, a beneficiary, not a client, not a peer. Calder closed his eyes. The man next to him laughed again, louder this time. "Hell, they'll be giving out champagne in food stamps next," he muttered. Calder opened his eyes and stared straight ahead. The clouds outside the window moved in slow, silent layers, untouched by the noise within the aircraft. He wished he could be among them. Just for a moment, just long enough to forget. Instead, he sat under fluorescent lighting, surrounded by luxury and poisoned by its gatekeepers. He thought of his childhood, of standing in line for public assistance with his mother, of the time a woman in front of them dropped her food vouchers and said nothing as the wind carried them away. His mother had watched, lips pressed tight, and said quietly that dignity was not what they gave you, but what they couldn't take. That memory clung to him now. It grounded him more than the seatbelt ever could. The brunette returned one more time. She carried a single glass of water, condensation trickling down its side. The murmurs had grown more casual now, less cautious, as if the crowd had silently agreed he was fair game. The quiet cruelty of condescension had turned into something more open, more dangerous. Every shift of the attendants, every sideways glance from his neighbors, carried an air of mockery dressed as routine. And then, as if the universe needed punctuation, it happened. The brunette flight attendant from earlier, older than the others, her name tag reading Margaret, her makeup applied with heavy, deliberate hands, appeared once again down the aisle with a tray of beverages. Her steps were measured but purposeful, her chin raised slightly, and her smile absent. She stopped at Calder's row without greeting, reaching toward the man in 2D with a practiced, robotic movement, setting a drink down with elegance. Then she turned toward Calder, holding a glass of orange juice that trembled slightly at the rim. As she leaned over to hand it to him, the tray suddenly tilted forward. The liquid, chilled and dense, splashed across Calder's coat sleeve, bleeding into the fabric like ink into linen. The cold shocked his arm, but his face didn't change. He looked at the glass, still half full in her hand, and then at his sleeve, wet, sticky, and bright with citrus. Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly, her expression bordering on theatrical surprise. But there was no apology, no gasp, no flustered recovery, only a single comment, uttered just loud enough for the man beside Calder to hear. "I suppose that fabric won't be too hard to clean," she said, voice flat. "Doesn't look like the kind that needs special care." The man in 2D chuckled under his breath and turned toward the window, clearly amused. Calder slowly lifted his napkin from the tray and dabbed at his sleeve, working in silence. His hands were steady, his breath shallow. A few rows back, someone laughed softly. Margaret lingered for a moment, then moved on without offering another word, another glass, or even the dignity of acknowledgement. The scent of orange settled around Calder like perfume, clashing with the cologne of his neighbor and the filtered air of the cabin. The wetness sank in, cold at first, then clammy. He stared at the spot as it darkened. Across the aisle, a man in his 60s wearing a tan blazer and a baseball cap leaned forward, rested his elbow on his tray, and called across with a grin. "Hey," he said, "you work with cargo or something?" Calder looked up slowly. The man's grin widened. "I've seen guys like you down at the tarmac, right? Maybe they're letting the ground crew fly up here now, huh?" A few people around them chuckled. Not full laughter, but that hollow, echoing kind that comes from people laughing to fit in, not because they find anything funny. The woman beside the man sipped her wine and said nothing, but her smirk betrayed approval. Calder said nothing. His fingers tightened around the napkin until the edge tore. He looked down and focused on his breathing. He remembered being 12, standing outside a store while his mother shopped inside, and hearing a man across the street call him baggage boy because he was holding her purse. He remembered pretending not to hear. He was pretending again now. But it didn't stop there. A woman in 3A, young and overdressed, leaned across the aisle and addressed Margaret as she returned up the cabin. "Do you think we could get another wipe?" she asked, nodding toward Calder. "Just in case the juice spreads." Margaret blinked, then nodded once, retrieving a cloth from the galley. She returned moments later, handed it to Calder without eye contact, and walked away again. He took it, dabbed his sleeve, listened as the man next to him whispered, "That's why I always wear navy on planes." Another round of chuckles drifted from somewhere nearby. Calder didn't move. He didn't look at anyone. He sat surrounded by laughter, held hostage by passive aggression and the kind of systemic disrespect that masqueraded as politeness. His coat had cost more than some of their monthly mortgages. His boots had been custom-made by a craftsman in Florence. But none of that mattered here. None of that saved him from being seen as something less refined, less important, less human. The orange juice dried into his coat as the attendants resumed their duties, avoiding his row like it was radioactive. The scent lingered. It was subtle, but persistent, a constant reminder. He closed his eyes again, resting the back of his head against the seat, trying to shut out the sound of his own humiliation. But humiliation doesn't need sound. It has shape. It has weight. It has 1,000 invisible hands that pull at your skin and press at your spine. He thought about his name, Calder Boone, a name forged from lineage, not accident. He thought about the walls of his office in Manhattan, lined with books and awards and framed contracts signed by people who never questioned his competence. He thought about his grandfather's hands, calloused and cracked from 60 years in a textile mill. He thought about how hard they had all worked for him to sit in this seat. And still it wasn't enough. The man in 2D turned to him again, seemingly emboldened by silence. "You know," he said casually, "most people up here don't stay this quiet. You one of those observation types? Taking notes or something?" Calder didn't respond. The man smiled wider, mistaking the silence for discomfort rather than discipline. "Well, enjoy it while you can," he added, sipping the last of his bourbon. "These seats are a once-in-a-lifetime thing for some folks." Calder inhaled slowly, counted to 3, let the air out. The aircraft hit a pocket of mild turbulence, causing a slight jolt. Margaret passed through again, this time checking seatbelts and stabilizing loose glasses. She looked at Calder's tray, still untouched, and paused. She said nothing, didn't ask if he needed a replacement, didn't offer another drink, just adjusted the empty holder beside his elbow and moved on. Across the cabin, the man in the tan blazer lifted his voice slightly. Every twitch of movement, every turn of his page, every breath seemed to draw glances, as if his continued presence was both offense and curiosity. The cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for dinner service, the type of subtle atmospheric shift designed to mimic restaurant elegance. A soft chime echoed above, prompting flight attendants to begin their rounds with linen-lined carts filled with steaming trays. Margaret returned to the cabin, this time with a silver trolley neatly organized with the fine china, glass stemware, and cutlery sets reserved for premium passengers. Her expression remained unchanged, blank but controlled, the kind of face worn by someone performing a task they have long since stopped caring about. She began to distribute the meals down the aisle with professional efficiency. Each passenger received a tray of brushed metal trimmed with gold, covered by a gleaming dome lid that released a puff of aroma when lifted. One passenger requested the lamb. Another asked for the seared trout. Each plate was paired with a stemmed glass of Pinot or Sauvignon, water served from a glass bottle wrapped in a napkin to prevent condensation. She offered options. She smiled. She joked. Then she reached Calder's row and stopped smiling. She opened the side panel of the cart and pulled out a small plastic container, clear, fogged from the heat, and sealed with a wrinkled plastic film. Inside was a lump of something unseasoned, mashed beside steamed vegetables that had turned the color of dull cement. There was no tray, no metalware, no cloth napkin, no wine. Alongside the container, she placed a single paper napkin, already crumpled at one edge, and a white plastic fork sealed in a plastic bag. The gesture was robotic, but her voice carried a different tone, just loud enough to rise above the background hum of engines and light conversation. "This should be easier," she said, not looking at him, "for passengers not used to handling silver." The sentence hit the air with the force of a slap. It was framed as casual observation, but loaded with accusation. Calder stared at the tray, then at her. Her face revealed nothing. The man in 2D looked over and smirked, chuckling softly. "Well," he said, lifting his wine glass, "guess they're doing the charity meals early this time." More laughter, not explosive, but cruel in its familiarity. Calder didn't move. He unfolded the crumpled napkin slowly and placed it in his lap, though it barely covered his thigh. The plastic fork cracked slightly as he removed it from the wrapper. He looked at the meal. It was lukewarm, congealed at the edges, the kind of food packaged for mass transportation and served without pride. All around him, porcelain clinked, knives scraped gently across thick cuts of meat, and glasses touched with a faint melodic chime. No one else had been given what he had. Not even the woman seated 2 rows back who had dietary restrictions. She had been served her special meal on silverware like everyone else. Margaret didn't ask if Calder wanted anything else. She didn't offer a drink. She simply moved on, her shoes clicking across the aisle as if the exchange had never happened. Calder picked up the plastic fork. The tines bent slightly as he pressed into the food. A smear of overcooked carrots stuck to the utensil. He took a bite. It tasted like cardboard and disdain. He forced himself to chew, to swallow, to keep his expression neutral. But inside, the insult was carving lines across everything he'd worked to build. He remembered the long hours at his first startup, the cold coffee-fueled nights coding alone, the rejection letters, the slow grind toward funding. He thought of the first time he earned enough to fly business, the feeling of stepping through the curtain without apology. That memory, once a badge of pride, now burned. He tried to ignore the laughter. He tried to ignore the whispers. But they grew louder. Maybe he's doing research, someone said 2 rows up. You know, those social experiment types, seeing how we treat the help. A middle-aged woman with a white scarf leaned toward the aisle and added, "You think they give out vouchers for people like that just to make the rest of us feel diverse?" Another round of quiet laughter. Margaret returned once more, this time to pour coffee. She moved through the cabin with swift efficiency, filling the white porcelain cups with the aroma of roasted beans. When she reached Calder, she paused. Her voice was flat, void of inflection. "Would you like any?" Calder glanced up. Her hand hovered over a paper cup, the kind used in economy, thinner, with no saucer. It had a pre-sealed lid already fastened. She didn't wait for an answer. She set it down, unrequested, next to his plastic tray. Then she continued on. Calder looked at the cup. It was branded with the airline's logo, but scuffed at the edges, likely pulled from the bottom of a backup drawer. The message was clear. Even his caffeine was disposable. The passengers continued their meals. Conversations resumed. Forks lifted fine food to polished teeth, while Calder picked through his meal with a bendable fork. He ate every bite, not because he was hungry, but because he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rejected. The man in 2D leaned toward him, the smell of wine thick on his breath. "Tell you what," he said, voice low, "I'll trade you half my steak for a story. What's it like in the back of the plane?" Calder looked at him, then looked away. He reached for the coffee cup. It was already cold. He took a sip anyway. Around him, the performance of luxury carried on. He was not part of it. He was never meant to be. He existed as a prop in their narrative, a curiosity they could prod with jokes and gauze-wrap civility. He finished the coffee. His coat remained stained with the dried remnants of orange juice, its scent now sour and sticky. He had not spoken. He had not complained. But silence was not enough. Not here. Not now. The flight had just passed its first hour when the shift came. Not atmospheric, not technical, but human, calculated, precise. One of the younger attendants, a man with sharp features and a nervous gait, approached Calder's row with an apologetic posture poorly executed. He knelt slightly to speak at eye level, clutching a small tablet, his fingers tapping as he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir," he said, not quite looking Calder in the eye. "We're making a few adjustments to passenger positioning for weight distribution. I'll need to move you to another seat." Calder blinked slowly. Around him, no one else stirred. No other passenger had been approached. No one else had been asked to move. And yet here was this man, rehearsing discomfort as policy. Calder kept his voice measured. "I'm sorry, is there a problem with this row?" The attendant hesitated, checking the tablet as if the screen might offer salvation. "No, sir, it's just protocol. Certain sections occasionally require rebalancing mid-flight for safety." Calder's gaze narrowed. "Is anyone else being moved?" The attendant's answer was delayed, fragile. "No, just this row. Just this seat, specifically." Behind them, Margaret stood at the curtain that divided first class from the galley, arms crossed, her lips pressed together in quiet approval. The man in 2D watched the exchange without blinking, a half-smile playing at his lips. Across the aisle, someone whispered. Calder shifted slightly in his seat, not aggressive, but firm. "I purchased this seat. I cleared security. I've complied with every request." The attendant's smile faltered. "I understand, sir, but the co-pilot has reviewed the numbers. I'm afraid I'll have to insist." Calder's eyes darkened. "And where exactly am I being moved to?" "Just a few rows back," the attendant answered, too quickly. "It's a bulkhead seat. Extra legroom." He said it as though legroom could substitute dignity. Calder sat upright. He adjusted the lapel of his coat and folded his hands. "I'd prefer to remain here." The attendant tensed. "Sir, I'm going to ask you again. For your safety and the comfort of all passengers, please move to the reassigned seat." "Comfort of all passengers?" Calder repeated, his voice quiet but sharp. "Or comfort of those uncomfortable with me being here?" The words hung in the air like static. The attendant took a step back. Then the curtain parted. The first officer entered. Tall, square-jawed, uniform crisp and badge shining beneath the cabin light. His presence commanded silence the way gravity held weight. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, voice cool, eyes trained on Calder. The attendant spoke quickly, eager for backup. "Passenger Boone is resisting a repositioning order, sir. It's part of our mid-flight balance protocol." The first officer turned to Calder, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I need your cooperation. This is a safety directive." Calder met his gaze. "A safety directive that affects only me?" The officer's jaw twitched slightly. "Sir, you can comply, or we will be forced to escalate." "I don't want to do that, but I can request a diversion if necessary." The word diversion sent a ripple through the cabin. Passengers stiffened. A woman clutched her handbag. A man lowered his book and listened more closely. Calder looked past the officer, past the attendants, past the gawking passengers. He looked at the polished floor, the brushed aluminum fixtures, the slick leather seats. He looked at the space that promised luxury but demanded submission. Then he nodded once. "You do what you need to do," he said, his voice level. The first officer stared at him for a long second, then turned to the attendant. "Leave it," he said. "We'll monitor the balance through system override." The attendant hesitated. "But sir—" "Leave it," the officer repeated, more forcefully. Then he turned and disappeared behind the curtain. Margaret stepped forward a moment later, gathering empty cups and wrappers. She looked down at Calder with a look that wasn't pity and wasn't respect. It was the look one gives to a loose object in a room that was once symmetrical, a nuisance that didn't quite belong. She didn't speak. She didn't collect his cup. She simply moved on. The man in 2D leaned back, exhaled loudly, and muttered, "Must be nice to have backup when you make things harder than they need to be." Calder didn't move. The cabin grew quiet again. But this time, the silence was different. Tense. Watching. The air seemed denser, as if every passenger was waiting for the next cue in a play they weren't part of, but couldn't stop watching. Calder opened his book. The pages had curled slightly from humidity and handling. He ran a finger across the margin. He didn't read. He just held the book, a shield, a weight, a reminder. Across the aisle, a woman whispered to her partner, "They always make everything so difficult. Just follow the rules and everything's fine." The warning from the first officer, the demand to move, the threat of diversion, it all lingered in his chest like a coiled spring. He hadn't moved. They had backed down. But it hadn't felt like a victory. It felt like a delay, as if the next strike was already being sharpened. The lights in the cabin remained dimmed. A few passengers reclined in their seats, some dozing lightly beneath soft blankets, others scrolling silently through glowing screens. Calder did neither. He remained upright, eyes open, body still. The only motion was the slow rise and fall of his chest. It was during this quiet pause that the next moment unfolded. A woman in her late 60s, seated in 3B, pressed the attendant button above her seat. She wore a floral scarf, large pearl earrings, and the kind of makeup that had been carefully applied but faded unevenly over the course of the flight. Her voice, gentle but confident, asked for another napkin. Margaret, who had reappeared with her usual expression of obligation, leaned forward to assist. The woman gestured with mild embarrassment to a small spill of wine on her lap. "Would you mind fetching an extra napkin, dear? I've already used the one provided." Margaret paused, then turned her eyes toward Calder. She pointed. "Passengers like him usually carry their own," she said flatly. "Perhaps he has one he can lend you." The words fell into the space like a dropped stone in still water. For a second, nothing moved. The older woman blinked in confusion, not understanding. Then she glanced at Calder, her brows knitting as her eyes swept over his coat, his posture, the invisible label now affixed to him by someone in uniform. She smiled politely, said nothing, and retrieved a tissue from her purse instead. Margaret walked away, as if the comment meant nothing. Calder didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply breathed, slower, deeper, drawing the air into lungs that felt heavier than before. The woman avoided eye contact. The insult, veiled and casual, remained. Another stone added to the pile building against his silence. The flight continued. An hour passed. The cabin lights brightened slightly as the crew prepared for descent. Announcements came through overhead speakers: arrival time, weather at destination, customs reminders. Calder adjusted his seat upright. He folded the blanket he hadn't used and returned it to the footrest. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a notepad, and jotted a single line of writing. Then he folded it closed and placed it back without a sound. Across the aisle, a father helped his young son buckle into a seat. The boy, no older than 7, had spent much of the flight playing games on a tablet, feet dangling from the edge of the cushion. As the plane began its gentle descent, the boy looked across at Calder, then turned to his father and asked, not whispering, not shy, but curious, "Daddy, is that man a criminal?" The question was loud enough to carry 4 rows in either direction. The father stiffened, glancing at Calder, then leaned in and whispered to his son. The boy persisted, "But I heard the lady say something earlier about his record." Calder's eyes remained ahead, fixed on nothing, but he heard every syllable. The man shushed the child. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. The woman with the pearl earrings coughed softly, eyes forward. No one said anything. No one corrected the child. No one defended the man. The phrase "his record" came from somewhere. A seed planted by implication, watered by silence. Calder inhaled through his nose, exhaled slowly. His hands rested on his thighs, palms down, nails tight against skin. He did not move. He did not respond. But inside, the humiliation calcified. It had transcended private shame. It was now public mythology. He had become not just a curiosity, but a symbol, a warning, a stereotype resurrected in real time, dressed in subtle professionalism, delivered through microtones and half-truths. As the wheels of the plane extended beneath them and the lights of the city below emerged like scattered diamonds, Calder sat trapped inside a vessel designed to soar yet filled with men and women who had caged him in place with judgment. The plane jolted gently as it landed. The seatbelt sign pinged. Margaret's voice returned on the intercom, thanking passengers for flying with them, instructing them to remain seated until arrival procedures were complete. Calder waited. He remained seated as others retrieved their bags, adjusted their coats, and stepped out of first class with the relaxed urgency of the privileged. The father guided his son past Calder without a word. The boy stared. Calder did not look back. The woman with the wine stain avoided his gaze. The man in 2D exited with a short glance and a smirk, muttering, "Hope your next flight's better, partner," as if that counted as civility. Calder rose last. He reached for his bag. He adjusted the collar of his coat. The stain had dried. The plastic fork had been discarded. The notes remained tucked inside his jacket. But Calder heard none of it. He kept walking with the slow certainty of a man who no longer needed to convince anyone of his right to be present. The humiliation of the flight still clung to him like a second skin, sticky, tight, and invisible to those who caused it. His coat bore the dried stain of orange juice, his eyes the weight of passive hostility, and his silence now held the gravity of consequence. He turned left where the others turned right, stepping past the ropes that separated passengers from crew and officials. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. Not the security officer at the gate, not the ground staff by the terminal wall, not the lead flight attendant who glanced up from her tablet and instinctively stepped aside. He didn't need to flash a badge. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply walked, and the world made space. He moved past gates and terminals until he reached the administrative corridor, a space few passengers ever entered, guarded not by checkpoints, but by coded locks and the assumption of exclusivity. He reached a plain metal door and entered a code. The lock released. He stepped inside. The room was modest but sharp, an operations office dressed in glass panels, steel accents, and the sterile scent of commercial-grade upholstery. A young officer behind a desk looked up from his monitor, startled for half a second before recognition set in. He stood quickly, adjusted his jacket, and said nothing. Calder passed him without stopping. At the end of a hallway, the door to the briefing room stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open. Inside, 3 men sat at a table reviewing post-flight logs. One of them, wearing 4 gold stripes on his sleeve and a tired expression of command, looked up. It was the captain. His brow furrowed, but he didn't speak. Calder stood tall, coat unbuttoned, breath steady, then spoke with the same composure he had maintained all flight. "Effective this morning. Your funding agreement is null," he said. "The partnership contract terminated at 6 o'clock hours." The words struck the air not like a threat, but like a statement of weather, a simple, irreversible fact. The captain stood slowly, as if trying to comprehend the weight behind the sentence. Calder stepped closer, placing a single document envelope on the table in front of him. "This was delivered to your executive board 3 days ago. The required waiting period lapsed. The withdrawal is complete." The room fell into silence. The other officers exchanged uncertain glances. The captain opened the envelope and read the first page. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with the dawning horror of consequence. Calder watched him read. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The captain looked up. "Mr. Boone," he began, but Calder raised a hand. "This is not a negotiation," he said. "This is closure." Then he turned and walked out. He passed back through the hallway, the officer at the front desk now standing at attention. As Calder exited the door, his phone buzzed once in his pocket. He retrieved it, scanned the notification, and gave a quiet nod to himself. The transaction had processed. The remaining shares had been liquidated. The company's valuation would plummet by morning. Across terminals, digital boards refreshed with silent updates. Investors wouldn't know yet, but within the hour, the call would come. Calder stepped into the daylight outside the terminal, sunlight cutting across the concrete in long, sharp beams. His driver waited in a black sedan by the curb. The door opened before he reached it. As he sat down, he looked once at the airport behind him, then said simply, "Take me downtown." The driver nodded and pulled away from a curb. Calder leaned back into the seat, removed the stained coat, folded it neatly beside him, and closed his eyes. Inside the top floor of the tower, 10 board members sat in half silence, their voices low, their movements stiff, their coffee cups untouched. At the head of the table, Veronica Sutherland, Senior Operations Director, and a woman who had built her career on precision, reputation, and merciless diplomacy, reviewed the figures on the screen with a stillness that bordered on paralysis. She had read the numbers once, then again, then a third time, as if repetition would reveal an error. There was no error. The company's valuation had dropped by 63% between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. 47 institutional investors had withdrawn simultaneously. 3 private equity firms froze their partnerships. 2 strategic international holdings invoked exit clauses that had never before been touched. None of it made sense until the file appeared. An external notification from a legal advisory group in New York included a simple attachment: Boone Directive Termination and Withdrawal. Veronica opened it and found her answer: Calder Boone, a name that had surfaced multiple times in quarterly investor briefings as a silent partner and long-term stabilizer. A man often referred to in legal text, but never by appearance. A man whose holdings had always been marked as non-interfering equity. She blinked at the signature. It was real, certified, dated, notarized. The withdrawal had not only been planned, it had been guaranteed. They just hadn't noticed. Or rather, they hadn't bothered to check. Now the boardroom buzzed with panic, disguised as protocol. Analysts were called in. Legal reviewed the damage. PR scrambled to prepare statements. Veronica stood slowly, placed her tablet down on the dark walnut table, and said with icy clarity, "I want the head of finance, the chief legal officer, and investor relations in this room in 10 minutes. I don't care what time it is." Her voice cut through the tension, commanding movement. One of the junior staffers nodded and fled the room. Someone else muttered that market freeze could still be negotiated. Another suggested reaching out to their regulatory contact. But Veronica knew better. This wasn't a leak. It was an execution. She turned toward the window and stared at her reflection in the glass, her sharp gray suit silhouetted against the smudged glow of an uncertain sunrise. Behind her, the door opened, not with haste, with control. The man who entered didn't announce himself. He didn't have to. The room quieted immediately, air thick with recognition and discomfort. Calder Boone walked to the far end of the boardroom, his pace even, his gaze level, his presence no longer ignored or tolerated but undeniable. He carried no files, no assistants, no dramatics, just authority wrapped in silence. Veronica turned and faced him. Her face remained composed, but her posture shifted. A half step back, an instinctive recalibration. "Mr. Boone," she began, but he raised one hand. "You'll refer to me now," he said evenly, "as Chairman Boone." He walked to the seat at the head of the table, the one traditionally left for the presiding board figure, and sat. No one stopped him. No one even moved. The men and women who had once built careers on status, titles, and exclusivity now stared at the man they had tried to eject from their skies. "The emergency meeting you received was issued by me," Calder continued, fingers steepled in front of him. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, I've exercised controlling interest clauses outlined in the corporate restructuring agreement of your Series D financing. That agreement gave me the right to act unilaterally should operational ethics compromise brand integrity." A few of the board members exchanged nervous glances. One of them, the CFO, opened his mouth, but Calder's voice overrode his. "Before any of you speak, let me clarify what constitutes compromised ethics. Racially motivated passenger removals, discriminatory seating alterations, unwarranted ID verification based solely on appearance, denial of standard service, and a culture of microaggression masked as procedure." The words didn't echo, they settled. Heavy, real. Veronica straightened. "If this is about an isolated flight incident," Calder looked directly at her. "It was not isolated." He pulled a second document from his coat. He slid it down the table. "I commissioned a 6-month internal audit under alias operations. 8 separate flights, 14 discriminatory events. All documented, all time-stamped, all linked to your crew." Veronica's mouth closed. Her hand twitched, but didn't reach for the document. Calder continued. "As of this hour, I am placing the executive board under review. All department heads will report to me directly until further notice. And every crew member involved in the reported incidents will be suspended pending investigation." Someone whispered that this was a coup. Calder turned to that voice, eyes sharp. Every division head received a memo that began with a single sentence. "Effective immediately. All operations are under audit." Compliance officers across the nation were activated. Their inboxes flooded with instructions to retrieve archived crew reports, flight logs, customer service records, and internal communications dating back 5 years. Calder didn't have to micromanage. His directives were deliberate and rooted in structure. He knew where to look because he had already looked. While the board scrambled for damage control, the press caught wind of a corporate purge. At 10:26 a.m., a major financial news network ran a headline that shook investors globally. "Skylure Aviation faces historic leadership overhaul amidst allegations of racial discrimination." The story spread with velocity. Stocks halted. Analysts speculated. Whispers turned to full-blown declarations. And in the center of it all, the names of those who had once ruled the airline with unchecked power now appeared under a new column: liability. By noon, the CEO, once a media darling with a smile crafted for shareholder meetings, had submitted a terse resignation letter citing personal conflicts and misaligned values with the board. He left through a private elevator, escorted by legal counsel and a corporate security officer, his badge deactivated before the door closed behind him. His photo, once framed in the main atrium beneath the mission statement, was removed without ceremony. At the same time, 5 members of the executive committee were notified of their immediate termination. Their credentials were revoked, their emails shut down, and their severance packages frozen pending compliance review. No press conferences, no public farewells, just silence, as efficient as it was final. But the axis of the collapse centered not on the CEO, not even on the board, but on one woman, Veronica Sutherland. The name carried weight within the aviation industry, once synonymous with luxury operations and elite customer experience. But by the afternoon, her name was trending on every platform for an entirely different reason. The documentation Calder had submitted to the legal team, complete with flight footage, audio logs, and anonymous crew testimony, outlined a disturbing pattern: reassignments that disproportionately affected passengers of color, flagging tickets for secondary verification when visual discrepancies were claimed, refusing service enhancements based on vague performance evaluations. It was no longer a matter of workplace bias. It was systemic profiling packaged as policy. At 2:18 p.m., the FAA received a formal complaint issued directly from the Federal Department of Transportation Civil Rights Division, citing probable cause for regulatory violation and requesting a full compliance investigation. The memo named Veronica Sutherland as a primary subject. At 2:43 p.m., Calder's legal team filed a separate federal civil suit, naming her personally for conduct amounting to racial discrimination under Title VI. By 3 p.m., her access card no longer worked at headquarters. Her name was removed from the internal executive roster. Her email redirected to an automatic reply. This account is no longer active. Her phone rang only once before cutting to voicemail. Internally, HR issued a memo to staff confirming her permanent departure and compliance cooperation with government investigators. In the industry, the ripple was louder. A coalition of airline executives, in an effort to avoid reputational damage by association, blacklisted her from future recruitment pipelines. No airline under the International Civil Aviation Association would touch her file. Even luxury hotel chains and travel conglomerates sent private advisories to human capital divisions, stating that any affiliation with her name might signal complicity. In under 12 hours, Veronica Sutherland went from commanding respect to representing scandal. She sat alone in her high-rise apartment that evening, scrolling through news alerts, statements from her former employer, and social feeds filled with headlines like "Justice at 30,000 feet" and "Airline exec fired after passenger exposes racism." Her expression remained fixed, but her hands trembled slightly over the screen. The woman who once walked terminals like runways now faced a future that no longer included flight. The months that followed the collapse of Skylier's executive structure marked a silent season of reckoning, not only for the organization that had once stood as a gleaming standard of luxury, but for those within it who had built careers on exclusion masked by efficiency. Veronica Sutherland disappeared from headlines long before the lawsuits reached their slow settlements. Her name gradually replaced by newer scandals and fresher narratives. But in the quiet spaces of consequence, in the long, sleepless nights spent alone inside a modest apartment stripped of luxury, she endured a far more complex sentence. She had not been imprisoned in the physical sense, no bars, no guards, no court-issued restraints, but what she lived through was a confinement of the soul, a dismantling of identity that no judgment could soften. Her phone stopped ringing. The friends who had once jostled for seats beside her at galas and fundraisers no longer returned her calls. The colleagues who once toasted her promotions avoided eye contact when they passed her in shared grocery aisles. Every attempt to apply elsewhere ended in rejections phrased with passive bureaucracy. Her name had become shorthand for institutional failure, and still she remained. At first, she had fought it. She wrote letters to editors. She drafted statements of defense. She crafted interviews in her head that never aired. But over time, the resistance gave way to something more still, more painful. One evening, 6 months after the final legal decision had rendered her permanently unfit for any executive role within a federally regulated aviation entity, she stood before her bathroom mirror and whispered to herself the words she had never allowed anyone else to hear. I was wrong. The words didn't echo. They sank. In the following weeks, she began reading, not public relations manuals, not compliance protocols, but the stories of people she once overlooked. She read case files on workplace discrimination. She studied the structure of unconscious bias. She devoured memoirs of survivors who had spent lifetimes trying to be heard in rooms where people like her had spoken over them. Then she reached out. At first, her emails were ignored. Then one organization, quiet, underfunded, and based in a converted warehouse on the edge of the city, responded. They didn't ask for her resume. They didn't greet her with suspicion. They asked her to come and listen. Not to speak, just to listen. And she did. She sat in the back row of a community center, listening to stories told not with rage, but with rawness. A young man spoke about being removed from his flight 3 times in a single year because his name sounded foreign. A woman recounted how her hair had been touched without permission by multiple crew members during one flight. A teenager described the shame of being publicly questioned about his ID when no one else had been. Veronica said nothing. She sat, still, her fingers clenched together until they ached. But she stayed. She returned the next week, and the week after that. Eventually, one of the program leaders approached her and asked if she would be willing to share her story. She hesitated. Then she said yes. She stood in front of a dozen strangers and recounted the rise and fall, not of her career, but of her awareness. She didn't defend. She didn't excuse. She said plainly and carefully what she had done, what she had allowed, and what she had ignored. She used phrases she had once mocked. Structural blindness, complicit in silence, ethical failure. And the people in the room listened, not with forgiveness, but with attention. That was enough. Over time, she was invited to speak at training sessions for young flight attendants. She stood in dull conference rooms filled with recruits barely out of school, and she told them what not to become. She described how easy it was to justify small cruelties as protocol. She detailed the way bias doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in soft smiles, in seating changes, in who gets offered wine and who gets questioned twice. She ended each session the same way. What we allow quietly, she told them, we enforce publicly. The words became something more than warning. They became curriculum. 2 years later, Veronica used the settlement funds she had quietly negotiated to open a small institute focused on equity in frontline service training. Not a grand building, not a lavish foundation, just 4 rooms and a curriculum built on listening. She did not use her name for branding. She did not seek praise. But word spread, and eventually it reached Calderboone. He did not respond immediately. He watched from a distance, tracking her growth with the same scrutiny he once reserved for mergers and audits. Then one day, an invitation arrived. A panel discussion on systemic reform in aviation and customer experience. The final speaker slot was left unnamed. The event was hosted by an alliance of civil rights groups and former industry executives. Veronica opened the door and entered the venue without a security badge, without a VIP line, without ceremony. The room was full. Among the audience were former critics, former peers, and faces she had once served with forced smiles and hidden contempt. On stage, seated beside government officials and diversity advocates, sat Calderboone. He looked at her not with anger, but with examination. She took her seat. When her turn came, she rose, adjusted her blouse, and stepped to the microphone. She did not begin with apology. She began with a question. What happens when your success is built on someone else's silence? And then she told the story, not of a fall, but of a re-education, of learning what she had never been taught, of unlearning what she had assumed was normal, of making room. When she finished, there was no applause, only quiet, a deep, shared stillness. Then Calder stood. He walked to the microphone. He looked at her. Change, he said, doesn't erase what came before, but it does decide what comes next. She nodded. He extended a hand. She took it. In that moment, the arc closed. Not in absolution, not in triumph, but in truth. The end. If this story moved you or made you think differently, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives like this one. Let us know in the comments what moment hit you the hardest. And where in the world are you watching from? Your thoughts matter, and we'd love to hear your perspective.